How did hunter-gatherers get their salt? And if we eat the amount that seems appetizing to us on real unprocessed food, do you think that's more salt than our ancestors had? Do we possibly need more salt than they had? Thanks. Love you guys.
Great
This
question.
is a great question. Unfortunately, I often start with like one question that just really grabbed me, and it's a question that we could spend the whole 2 hours on.
The whole 2 hours.
God, there's so much to say here. If you really aren't eating any processed food at all, and your palate is actually as it would be without all of those other inputs, you still, and that's very hard to do, right? That's basically none of us, but you still, I think, might end up wanting to add more salt than people of old did because our soils are not as rich in minerals, including salts, as they used to be, I believe.
All right. Also a factor, though, because of the way markets distribute food and the fact that those who sell us food make money if they cause us to return to their source of food, etc., something that's very unlike the natural environment. They have added extra salt because it is a cheap way to get food to taste more lively. And the problem with salt...
That's my point about processed food.
Right. But my point is that market mechanism of getting you to eat more than you would, getting you to return to a food that you think tastes better than it does because it's saltier, causes a calibration for us to become less sensitive to salt, which is why we then put more salt on our own food. So
I guess that was implied in what I said.
It is.
Yeah.
But I would say, first of all, there are lots of different kinds of hunter-gatherers. I don't think the Inuit had a salt issue at all, right? Because they're eating, you've got the sea, right?
Well, but I guess part of the question seems to be like, did any hunter-gatherers, regardless if they were mostly hunters or mostly gatherers or something in between, had a salt issue per se?
Well, maybe. I will say when I was lucky enough as a kid to go to East Africa, and we met some people. I can't remember exactly what they were doing, but they were studying something off in the bush somewhere where they had no contact with, or no regular contact with markets or anything. And my parents asked if there was anything that we could get for them, and they begged us to send them salt. So they obviously weren't hunter-gatherers.
Sorry, I was looking. Who did you say? I know you said it was on your East Africa trip, but
a couple that was researching something in a very remote place.
Some like white anthropologist couple.
Right.
Wanted salt.
Right, which just says it wasn't that they stopped eating salt because it wasn't around, and
they were craving the salt.
They were craving the salt.
That's interesting.
I would say also, though, hunter-gatherers certainly frequent...
And that would have been late 70s, early 80s, something like that?
It would have been early 80s.
Okay.
The hunter-gatherers are often going to frequent places that attract animals. Often places that attract animals do suggest that there's a limitation of salt because animals are attracted to places where water has collected and evaporated and left salt behind. So that's a good way of finding animals, but it means that the animals are limited enough to take the risk of going to a place that they can predictably be found, which is why, of course, leaving a block of salt also attracts things like deer. And so anyway, I do think that there is some indication that if you're not on the coast, you may have a limitation on salt.
Yeah.
And
on the coast you won't. And I mean, we've run into salt licks in a couple of different formats in the Amazon, both the clay walls that the parrots go to, and then the depressions that are like seasonal
drying out places where salt comes in with the water and then the water leaves,
and little deer and such show up. You were
frowning. I was not aware. I may just not know, but I was not aware that the clay walls that attract parrot relatives or about salt. I thought that was about limiting minerals, but not NaCl.
I think it's also salt, but I may be wrong about that.
And there was the last piece of the question.
Do we possibly need more salt than they had?
Obviously, you will be well adapted to the limits of whatever your ancestral environment had. So it may be that there were behavioral corrections Is it possible that our modern diet leaches salt and causes us to need more? That's certainly possible, but I think the primary culprit that would suggest we need more salt than they do is the abuse of salt to sell food, which then causes you to be less sensitive to salt, which causes you to use more salt. So it's a positive feedback.
Yeah.
Hello, friend.
That's right. And yes, absolutely true. Salt has been used for preservation for thousands of years. It's one of I think the oldest forms that we know of.
Absolutely.
Any kind of anoxic preservation forms exist. Lots of them, but salt encrusting.
Yep.
Is definitely one.
Sugar also works for the same reason, but salt works better and has been easier to come by because it concentrates naturally in the world.
Yeah, and you end up with, rubbing off coarse salt. Well, salt exists in a form that is crystalline in the world, whereas sugar requires that you process it to turn it into something that you can coat stuff in. And there's a lot of stuff that you would preserve that you don't want to have added sugar to.
Yeah, it's also the case, though, that you can concentrate sugar, but on the way there, you have small enough amounts of sugar that living things can eat it. And so you don't tend to have, it's only when you get to industrial sugar production that you have enough sugar to utilize to make that process work.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Next question. It's a little long, but I think it's got some interesting stuff in it. Wang Nanfu, whose name I am presumably mispronouncing, is a Chinese-born American documentary filmmaker. One of her works is One Child Nation, about, you guessed it, China's one-child policy. Interestingly, her name translates to man-pillar because even though she was a girl, her parents wanted her to grow up strong like a man. In one part of the film, she visits her village, and an older man says that the preference for boys is because, quote, without a boy, we will go extinct. I believe he meant his lineage, and my question is, do humans really have this instinctual knowledge that is our primary purpose to extend our lineage? I know we're driven to reproduce, but is it specifically for our lineage? If so, is this cognitive? I suspect not, and assuming not, how did it become cognitive such as this fellow? Also, technically speaking, I think the woman contributes more DNA and I believe more culture to the children than men, so if you really wanted your lineage to succeed, you'd want a girl, correct? If so, why is the preference for boys for the purposes of lineage prevalent in certain cultures just the surname, or is this the biological, evolutionary, cognitive, traditional roots of patriarchy? So there's a lot there, and there's a certain amount of confusion here. Let's see if we can untangle it. Hey guys, that was a clip from our monthly private Q&A that you can get access to at my, Heather Hying's, Patreon. And you can also get access there to all of the past paid subscriber content. So please consider joining us there.
Did you mention that these private Q&As are the key to living a better life and living to tell the tale?
I forgot to do that. These private Q&As are in fact the key to living a better life and what?
Living to tell the tale.
Living to tell the tale. Go ahead, live to tell the tale. Join us there.
See ya.